Imagine standing in a courtroom, accused of something you didn't do, with all eyes judging you. But the truth you hold within is far more powerful than anyone could imagine. The courtroom was silent, except for the slow ticking of the grand clock on the wall. The air was thick with judgment, a quiet tension settling over the wooden benches filled with onlookers. Some whispered among themselves, their hushed voices carrying disbelief. Others simply sat back, arms crossed, their expressions already set in stone. In the center of it all, standing behind the defendant's table, was Malik, a 10-year-old boy, small in stature but with eyes that held something far greater than fear. His hands rested on the cold wooden table, fingers curled slightly, his heart pounding so loud it almost drowned out the judge's voice. "Malik Carter," Judge Whitmore said, his tone heavy with disinterest, as if the boy's fate had already been sealed. He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. "You have been accused of theft. The evidence against you is compelling, and I see no reason to believe otherwise." Malik swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the audience. He could see them all, the faces of people who had never truly seen him before. They saw only what they wanted to see: a poor black boy, a troublemaker, a thief. The words stung, not because they were true, but because they had been said about boys like him for generations. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about the weight of history pressing down on his small shoulders. His mother sat in the front row, her hands gripping her purse, her lips pressed together so tightly they were almost white. He could see the fear in her eyes, the silent plea that she wasn't allowed to voice in this place. "Please, Malik, choose your words carefully." But Malik wasn't afraid of words. He knew their power. The prosecutor, a tall, thin man with slicked-back hair, adjusted his suit and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the store owner himself identified this boy as the culprit. The stolen items were found near the alleyway where he was last seen. We have multiple witnesses who claim they saw a boy of his description running from the scene. It's an open and shut case." Malik's fingers curled tighter against the table. He wanted to scream that they were wrong, that they didn't know what really happened. But screaming wouldn't change anything. He had seen enough to know that in rooms like this, the loudest voice was never the one that got heard. It was the one that spoke with unwavering certainty. Judge Whitmore exhaled heavily. "Before I pass judgment, does the defendant have anything to say in his own defense?" The room seemed to shrink. All eyes turned to Malik, waiting. Some were bored, others were amused, but most of them had already made up their minds. Malik took a deep breath, and then he spoke. "The store owner never saw my face," Malik said, his voice steady despite the weight pressing against his chest. "He saw a boy who looked like me, but he never saw me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting, young man?" Malik straightened his shoulders. "I'm suggesting that you're looking at me, but you're not seeing me. You're seeing what you expect to see." A hush fell over the room. Malik continued. "If I had been someone else, someone who didn't look like me, would you have already decided I was guilty?" The prosecutor scoffed. "This is not a debate about race." "But it is," Malik interrupted, his voice unwavering. "Because if it weren't, you'd be asking for real evidence, not just assumptions." Judge Whitmore frowned. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a child. Malik turned to the prosecutor. "You said people saw a boy running from the store. But did they see my face? Did they see what I was wearing? Or did they just see a black boy and assume it was me?" Silence. Malik's heart was racing, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. I didn't take anything. I was never near that store that day, but none of that matters because you never even considered that I might be telling the truth. His words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over the room like a storm cloud. For the first time, some of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably. The certainty in their expressions wavered. The judge drummed his fingers against the desk. He looked at Malik, truly looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. "Do you have any proof to back your claim?" Malik swallowed, his mind racing. Then, from the front row, his mother slowly rose to her feet. "I do," she said. And just like that, the entire courtroom shifted. Malik had always known that the world wasn't fair. He had seen it in the way people looked at him when he walked into a store, in the way teachers watched him more closely than his classmates, and in the way police cars slowed down whenever he and his friends were on the sidewalk. At 10 years old, he had already learned lessons most adults never had to. Keep your head down. Don't talk back. Stay out of trouble. But even when he followed the rules, trouble had a way of finding him. His mother had raised him to be smart, to think before he spoke, and to always tell the truth. She worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, coming home exhausted, but still managing to remind him that he was meant for something greater. "You're not just another kid in the system," she would tell him. "You're more than what they see." But no matter how many times she said it, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that the world had already decided who he was. And now, standing in a courtroom where everything was stacked against him, that feeling had never been stronger. At the front of the room, seated behind a towering wooden bench, Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses and studied the young boy before her. She had been serving in this courthouse for decades, priding herself on her ability to clean up the streets and teach troubled kids a lesson. She had sentenced dozens of boys just like Malik, and to her, this case was no different. A black boy from a poor neighborhood accused of stealing. It was nothing she hadn't seen before. She considered herself a fair judge. She believed in discipline, in consequences, in making sure that those who stood before her understood the weight of their actions. But what she didn't realize, what no one had ever told her, was that her sense of justice wasn't built on truth. It was built on bias, on assumptions, on the belief that some people were simply more likely to be guilty than others. To her, Malik fit the description. The prosecutor had laid it out so clearly. A boy matching his description had been seen running from the scene of the crime. A store had been robbed, and the stolen items were found nearby. What more was there to discuss? Malik was just another case, another statistic. She had already made up her mind before he even opened his mouth. But Malik knew the truth. The day of the robbery, he hadn't been anywhere near that store. He had been with his little sister, walking her home from school. She had scraped her knee on the way, and he had stopped to help her, using his own shirt to wipe away the blood. His only crime had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time. When the police stopped him, they hadn't asked him where he had been. They hadn't listened when he tried to explain. They had taken one look at him, at his skin, at his clothes, and decided that he was guilty. And now he was here, facing a judge who had already decided his fate. The courtroom was filled with murmurs, whispers of people who had already made up their minds about him. Some shook their heads, convinced that kids like him were always up to no good. Others barely paid attention, knowing how these trials always ended. But Malik wasn't going to let them write his story for him. He stood taller, refusing to let the weight of their judgment press him down. He met the judge's gaze, his voice steady, despite the pounding in his chest. "I didn't do this," he said. Judge Whitmore sighed, her expression unreadable. "Then prove it." Malik knew that no matter what he said, it wouldn't be enough. The truth didn't always matter in places like this. But he had one thing no one could take from him, his voice, and he was going to use it. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open, and Malik stepped inside. His small frame looked even smaller beneath the towering columns and the cold, unforgiving fluorescent lights. The air was thick with judgment, the kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud. It lived in the narrowed eyes of the spectators, in the slow shake of a head from a stranger, in the way the officers stationed by the door stood just a little taller when he walked past. He swallowed hard, but didn't let his fear show. He had promised himself he wouldn't. Judge Whitmore sat high on her bench, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Malik. She exhaled sharply, already tired. She had handled cases like this before, and in her mind, she already knew how this would go. "The court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The case of the state versus Malik Carter." The whispers started immediately. Just another kid who got caught up in trouble. His kind always end up here sooner or later. They'll let him off easy, and he'll do it again next week. Malik clenched his fists at his sides but kept his expression blank. He wouldn't let them see him break. The prosecutor, a tall man with a sharp suit and an even sharper tongue, wasted no time. "Your Honor, we have eyewitnesses. We have physical evidence. And we have a pattern. This young man comes from a background that has led too many down the same road. This is not just about this one crime. It's about the kind of future we are trying to prevent." Judge Whitmore nodded slowly, as if she agreed with every word. Then she turned her attention to Malik. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Malik stepped forward, clearing his throat. He had rehearsed this in his head 100 times, but now that he was standing here, all those words felt too small. The truth wasn't something that could be neatly packaged into a single defense. But he had to try. "The last time I saw my sister," he said, his voice steady but quiet, "she told me she'd come back, but she never did." The room went still. The whispers stopped. Even the judge seemed caught off guard. Malik took a slow breath. "She went out one night. Just to the store. Just for a few minutes. She never made it back. And you know what they told my mother when she asked for help? They told her my sister must have run away. That girls like her always do. That she wasn't worth looking for." His gaze moved across the room, catching the eyes of the people who had already decided he was guilty. "And now I'm standing here, accused of something I didn't do. And you're telling me the same thing, that boys like me always end up here, that it doesn't matter what I say, because you've already made up your mind." Judge Whitmore shifted in her seat, but Malik wasn't done. "You say you have witnesses," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "But did they see my face? Did they see what I was wearing? Or did they just see a black boy running and assume it was me?" No one answered. He turned to the prosecutor. "You say there's a pattern, but whose pattern is it? The one you already believe in? Or the one that's real?" Silence. His heart was pounding, but he didn't let his fear show. "Because here's the truth," he said, his voice calm now. "If I was guilty, you wouldn't need assumptions. You wouldn't need stereotypes. You wouldn't need history to tell you what kind of boy I am. You'd have proof." Judge Whitmore inhaled sharply, her expression unreadable. She had been in this courtroom for years, had passed judgment more times than she could count, but no one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever made her pause. Malik met her eyes. "I didn't take anything. I wasn't even there. But none of that matters, does it? Because before I walked through that door, you had already decided what kind of person I was." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. The room, once filled with murmurs and quiet scorn, was now utterly silent. Judge Whitmore looked down at the papers in front of her, the carefully laid-out evidence that suddenly didn't seem so certain. The prosecutor shifted, his confidence slightly shaken. Malik took a step back, his breath steady. He had said what he needed to say. Now, it was up to them to decide if they would listen. What would you do in this boy's shoes? How can we fight for justice when the system is broken? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. The courtroom was tense, every eye locked onto Malik as his words echoed through the silent chamber. The weight of his truth had settled over the room like an unshakable force. But Judge Whitmore barely faltered. She cleared her throat, her gavel poised to strike. "This is an emotional appeal, not a defense," she said, her voice sharp. "Without concrete evidence, the court has no choice but to—" Before she could finish, a voice interrupted her. "Wait!" All heads turned as Malik's mother stepped forward, her hands trembling as she clutched a folded piece of paper. Her eyes burned with determination as she held it up. This is my daughter's letter," she said. "The last thing she left behind before she disappeared." Judge Whitmore's gaze hardened. "And how is this relevant to the case?" Malik's mother swallowed hard, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "Because it proves my son was nowhere near that store that day." She unfolded the letter, her fingers gripping the edges. "It says right here, she was supposed to meet him that afternoon. They were together when this so-called crime took place." A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor frowned, stepping forward. "Let me see that." She hesitated before handing over the letter. The judge took it as well, reading the words carefully, her expression shifting from skepticism to something almost unreadable. It was all there: the time, the place, the undeniable proof that Malik couldn't have committed the crime. The judge's fingers tightened around the paper, her jaw clenching. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to make swift, decisive judgments. And yet, for the first time, she felt a crack in her certainty. She looked up at Malik, who stood unwavering despite the weight pressing down on him. She had been ready to dismiss him, ready to silence him before he could prove his innocence. And now, the truth stared her in the face, undeniable. Her voice was quieter when she finally spoke. "Malik Carter," she said slowly, each word more measured than the last. "This evidence changes things." The prosecutor looked as if he wanted to object, but remained silent. He had been so sure, so confident in his argument. Now, he couldn't meet Malik's eyes. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs of judgment, was now still. Judge Whitmore exhaled, setting the letter down. She turned to Malik's mother, then to the young boy before her. "I was wrong to assume," she admitted, "and for that, I owe you an apology." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. A judge, especially this judge, admitting fault was unheard of. Malik didn't say anything at first. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. She tapped her gavel against the desk. "The court finds Malik Carter not guilty." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then, a flood of emotions washed over the room. Malik's mother let out a breath she had been holding for too long, tears welling in her eyes. Some of the spectators, who had been so quick to judge him before, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But the real shift wasn't in the verdict. It was in the way Judge Whitmore looked at Malik now, not as a case, not as a statistic, but as a boy. A boy who had been forced to prove his humanity in a room that should have seen it all along. Malik met her gaze. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply nodded, because this wasn't just about winning a case. This was about making them see. The truth had always been there. They had just refused to look. Malik stepped out of the courtroom, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him. The afternoon sun hit his face, warm and unwavering, as if the universe itself was acknowledging what had just taken place inside. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. He had walked into that courtroom a boy accused of something he didn't do. He was walking out as something else entirely, a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of truth. His mother was by his side, her grip on his hand tight, as if she feared letting go would mean losing him again. He glanced up at her, and for the first time in weeks, he saw relief in her eyes instead of worry. She didn't have to say anything. He already knew what she was feeling. The crowd outside the courthouse had grown. Reporters stood by with cameras, ready to capture the moment. People from the neighborhood, some who had doubted him, some who had always believed in him, waited in quiet anticipation. The whispers had changed. He really proved them wrong. I can't believe they almost sent him away without real proof. He spoke like a man beyond his years. Malik didn't stop walking, didn't pause to soak in their words. He had never fought for attention. He had fought for something far more important. The right to be heard, to be seen, to be treated like he mattered. Behind him, Judge Whitmore lingered at the courthouse steps, watching him go. Something in her face was different. Hours ago, she had been ready to dismiss his words, ready to write him off as another case in a long list of names she had passed judgment on. But now, she stood in silent reflection, knowing that something in her had shifted. Later that evening, the judge issued a public statement. "I made an assumption, and I was wrong," she admitted. "Injustice doesn't always come in the form of a crime. Sometimes it's in the way we decide who is guilty before we even listen. Today, I was reminded of the importance of truth. I vow to ensure that every voice in my courtroom will be heard." It was the first time she had ever questioned herself so openly, and though words alone wouldn't fix a broken system, they were a start. Malik's story didn't end with the courtroom. News of his trial spread across the city. Schools began discussing his case in classrooms. Lawyers debated the role of bias in the judicial system, and conversations about fairness in the courtroom sparked movements in communities that had long been ignored. People who had never looked twice at kids like Malik now saw them differently. They saw potential. They saw strength. They saw that, given the chance, even a 10-year-old boy could stand against the weight of injustice and refuse to be crushed by it. But Malik wasn't thinking about any of that as he walked through his neighborhood that evening. He wasn't thinking about the reporters, the judge, or the whispers that followed him. He was thinking about his sister. The last time he had seen her, she had promised she would come back. She never did. But somehow, in some way, he felt closer to her now than he had in years. Maybe, just maybe, she had been watching over him all along. He reached his front steps, pausing for a moment to glance up at the sky before walking inside. His story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The courtroom had long emptied. but the echoes of Malik's words still lingered in the minds of those who had been there. What had started as a trial, meant to quietly convict a boy based on assumptions, had turned into something far greater, an awakening, a moment where truth shattered prejudice, forcing those who had ignored injustice for years to finally confront it. Malik's story was not just about proving his innocence. It was about breaking a cycle that had gone on for too long, where kids like him were judged before they had the chance to speak, where their futures were decided by people who had never taken the time to see them for who they really were. Judge Whitmore's decision to overturn the charges against Malik was a victory, but not just for him. It was a moment that shook the foundation of a system built on bias, a system that had failed so many before him. But was it enough? Malik knew that his case wouldn't erase the countless others who had been wrongfully convicted, the kids who had been silenced before they ever got the chance to defend themselves. He had won today, but tomorrow another boy would stand in front of a different judge, facing the same kind of prejudice. And that was the real battle. His story spread, reaching places he had never imagined. Activists cited his case when speaking out against racial injustice. Teachers used his testimony as an example of the importance of standing up for the truth. Conversations that had once been ignored were now being had in communities, schools, and courtrooms across the city. But Malik? He wasn't thinking about all of that. As he sat on the steps of his home, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and pink, he wasn't celebrating. He was reflecting, thinking about the people who had doubted him, the ones who had looked at him and only seen a statistic, thinking about his sister, whose absence still left a void in his heart, and thinking about the kids who would come after him, the ones who wouldn't have a voice unless someone spoke up first. He knew he had done something important, but he also knew that one case, one verdict, wouldn't be enough to fix everything. That was the question left hanging in the air. Was his bravery enough to change the system? Or was it only the beginning? What do you think? How can we, as individuals, fight for justice in the face of prejudice? Your voice matters. Join the conversation below. Don't forget to like and share this video to inspire others to stand up against injustice. And, if you haven't already, subscribe for more powerful stories like this.